This is Honors Algebra 2 Pre-Calculus. We're doing 1.5 in Algebra 2, which is scatter plots and least squares lines, which is just best fit line. Alright, so I took some data off page 37 of the textbook, which talks about chicken pox in the United States in the late 80s, early 90s. So I'm not going to read you the entire data table. You can look at it on the video, or you can look at it in the book. There are reported cases in thousands, and there are years starting with 1989. So a couple notes. We're going to go ahead and graph this in our calculator, and if you want, we can call this example 1. That's just fine. If I can figure out where I lost my marker. Okay, so we can call this example 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to, example 1, we're going to graph on the calculator, and then we're going to sketch roughly by hand, okay? And that's one of the things that I want to be clear on in your homework, is that if you're graphing something on a calculator or making a scatter plot on a calculator, I just need a rough version of that by hand. So we'll walk through that. Okay, so a couple things to note. The first thing is that sometimes when you have data, very often scatter plots are being used for data that include things like years, right? It's not a good plan to use 1989 as your x-coordinate, right? Because that would be a situation where I'd have to have that huge jump on the x-axis, because we're not starting this study in year 0, we're starting, right? So like that's a bad idea. So what you'll usually see is that when you do a scatter plot like this, instead of using the year as the x-axis, they'll use years since, and then they'll pick either the first year or the year before it. So they'll make 1988 year 0, which makes 1989 year 1, 1990 is year 2, year 3, and so on, right? So what I'm going to put in my calculator is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 instead of 1989, 1990, etc. But I need to be clear when I label my axes that when I do this, the reason I'm doing that is my axis is not years, it's years since 1988. Okay, so same thing when I label my y-axis. It wouldn't make sense to use 185,000 people, right? And it would be 185,400 people actually, because of that 0.4. That doesn't make sense. That's why the way this statistical data was written down was as 185.4. Okay, so let's walk through how we do this on a calculator. So I was going to try and do it on an emulator with a screencast, but failed miserably at it. So we're going to do it the old school way, and I'm going to show you on my calculator and walk you through the steps. So I have my TI whatever. It's an 83 plus, I think. Okay, so I have my TI 83 plus, right? So the first thing I want to be clear on is that your calculator is actually really intuitively arranged. So even if it doesn't feel that way, it's arranged in a pretty sensible way. So anytime you're dealing with statistical data that you need to enter in like a science class or in a stats class or whatever, you're going to use this stat button right here, okay? So stat. And I usually write them as buttons because I think it's a little bit easier. So I'm going to hit, so the first thing I need to do is put this data in my calculator. So I'm going to hit stat. Okay, and if you notice, the first thing listed after I hit stat is there's an edit choice. So I'm going to pick stat edit, which is what that button means. So stat edit, okay? And you'll notice I have a list 1 and list 2. Now, currently there's stuff in my list 1 and list 2 because I was doing some other math at some point, right? When you want to clear your list, you want to do just that. You want to go up to the top. So I'm going to go to list 1. I want to go up to where that L1 is, right? And I want to hit the clear button, not delete. Clear, and then enter, and it'll clear the list. If you hit delete, it accidentally deletes the entire list, meaning the whole column is gone, and that's not what you want. So I go to my L2, and I hit clear, and enter, and there you go. So now, when I go ahead and enter my list stuff in, it's way easier to just do one column at a time. So I see that my X's, which is going to be my L1, are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 1, enter, 2, enter, 3, enter, 4, enter, 5, enter, 6, enter. I go to the other side, which is the slightly trickier one. I have a 185.4, enter, 173.1, enter, 147.1, enter, 158.4, enter, 134.7, enter, and 151.2, enter. So when I end, you should see them line up, right? Now, I would suggest you go back and check your data. I would also suggest that if you're doing this in like a science class, and you have a lab partner, that one lab partner reads the data and the other one enters. It's much easier that way. Okay, so I have my stuff in. So that's my first task, right? So my first task was enter data. X1 is, or L1 is my X and L2 is my Y. Now, if you don't have an L1 and L2, use the first 2 available columns in that order, and we'll deal with that when we come to it. So next thing I want to do is actually plot my scatter plot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick Second and y equals, which is stat plot. So if you look, anytime you want to graph anything, it's always in the top line. In this case, right above the y equals, you'll see it say stat plot. So I press second and y equals, and it takes me to stat plot. Now I want to use plot 1. You don't have to use plot 1. You can use any of them, but it makes the most sense. So I want to use plot 1. Sorry, computer fell asleep. I want to use plot 1, so I'm going to pick that first one. Now I want to turn it on. Now mine looks a little bit different. Some of you will see that yours look a little different than this, but the short answer is that anytime you want to highlight something on your calculator, you hover over it and hit enter. So right now, off is the thing that's dark. I hit enter, and now it says on. So see how on is the thing that's dark? I want to pick the one that looks like a scatter plot, which is the top left one, the one I already have highlighted. And then I want to pick my X1 list, or my X list is L1 and my Y list is L2. Now, if you don't already have those as your choice, you can find that L1 and L2 by doing the second button, which is that yellow button on my calculator, and then the number 1. So let's say I didn't want L1. Let's say I wanted L3. I would do second and then 3, and now it says L3. Or second and L1, and now it says L1, okay? Now, if for some reason when you entered your stats in, you didn't have an L1 and L2, maybe you accidentally deleted those lists, let's say you used L3 and L4, then make sure you pick L3 and L4 respectively as your X and Y lists, okay? The next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I turn off any of the other plots and any graphs that I have that I'm using, right? Because I might have other stuff in my calculator, especially if I'm in a science class and a math class or multiple math classes, or just because I'm a math teacher, so I have a lot of stuff in my calculator. So I want to go, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to my y equals, just press y equals, and you'll see at the top you can actually see which plots are on. And right now, plot 1 is highlighted, and that's what I want. But you'll see that I also have 2 equations in here, and I don't want them. So I'm going to go, instead of clearing them out, because I might need them for something else in a different class, I don't in this case, but maybe I do, I'm going to go on top of the equal sign and hit enter, and that'll unhighlight it, and now they won't graph. So now you see I have 2 equations in there, but they won't graph. The reason I did that is because you want to get just your scatter plot, and if you have these other lines that you're not using for this problem, it's just going to be confusing, right? The last thing I want to do is I want to zoom, and I want to fit the statistical data that was handed to me. So I'm going to press the zoom button, which is the top middle, because anything graphing related is in the top row, and I'm going to scroll down to 9, which is zoom stat. So when I do that, I get a graph that looks like this. Now, I didn't mention that you can pick different shapes for your scatter plot. I always pick the one that's a little open square. It doesn't matter which one you pick. Now, you might not like the window that Zoom Stat gave you, and that's fine. The other way you can do it is you can literally go to Window, and you can pick something that fits your needs, right? So I noticed that the smallest X value was 1, and the largest one was 6. So maybe I go from 0 to 7, right? And that fits more with what they did. You'll also notice that they started at cases, like they jumped all the way up to, they jumped from 126 to 194. Maybe I don't want that. Maybe I want to go from 0 to 200, right? And if I did that, I'd probably want to go by, let's say, 20,000 cases at a time, right? So I changed that to fit a little bit better, but again, it's easier to start with a zoom stat and then adjust things accordingly. Now I hit graph, and there's my nice, happy statistical information. So let's talk about how we draw this if I were drawing it by hand, right? So I have this calculator version in front of me. If I sketch it by hand, remember, I need to have a title, right? So I'd probably say chickenpox in the US, right? On my y-axis, I have cases, reported cases in thousands, and I'll apologize for my terrible handwriting, right? I wanted it to go as high as 200,000, and that would make that 100, and I went by 20s. Okay. And then over here, it was years since 1988, and I know I needed to go up to at least 6. Oops, excuse me, up to at least 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There we go. 1, 2, 3. Right? Okay. Cool. So then I'm gonna go ahead and plot the information. Right? It doesn't have to be super duper accurate, but so I have my title. I have my scaled axes, right? And I have my units as needed and labeled on my axes. So I'm all good. So then I just kind of need to plot points, give or take, somewhat correctly. So these are going by 20s, right? If it helps you, you can label like 120, 140, 160, 180, right? That's fine. So 185 is going to be like here-ish. It's not great. 173 is going to be like here. 147 is sort of here-ish. 158 is about here. Again, nobody's bothered that you're not exactly perfect at this, right? 134 would be somewhere in this neck of the woods, and 151 would be somewhere around here. Great, okay? That's what I need from you in a scatter plot by hand. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It doesn't have to even be on graph paper. Just a rough idea. And if you note, the graph that I have on my calculator and the graph that I have by hand are fairly similar, right? They're not perfect, but it's fine. All right, so let's use this same example to talk about how we can actually find a line of best fit. So while we have this example up, and I'm going to go ahead and erase the steps here, right? So while we have this example up, let's talk about what we want in a line of best fit by hand, okay? So a line of best fit by hand, right? So again, also called a least squares line, right? So the things that a best fit line should do by hand. Okay, number one goes with the trend of the data. So with the data trend, okay. Number two, close to splitting the data in half, meaning like some is on each side of the line. And number three, ideally hits 2 points. And that's really just because we're lazy, and that's for easy calculation, okay? So this is, again, if you were totally doing a best fit line by hand, which you probably would not be doing here. It's not a great idea to do a best fit line by hand, but just to make clear that that's what you're looking for. So here's what I mean by with the data. Okay, so let's say I have data that looks like this. Okay, if I wanted the best fit line for this data, this line definitely splits the data pretty close to in half. There are 4 dots on this side, there's 5 dots on this side, but it doesn't go with the trend of the data. Data is very clearly going uphill, right? This is a positive correlation. So that doesn't go with the trend of the data. This arrow does go with the trend of the data, but is sitting above the data, not cutting the data sort of in half, right? So what I want ideally is a line that kind of goes through the middle, cutting this mostly in half, and also conveniently hits a couple of points. Yeah, that wasn't great. I can do better. So there's a reason you don't do this by hand, just to be clear, because it's a pain. Okay, but like in this situation, I hit 2 of the points. I've got 3 dots above the line. I've got 4 dots below the line, and I'm clearly trending with the data. So that's what we're looking for in a best fit line by hand. Again, the reason we want to hit 2 points is that we really want to be able to use those 2 points to find slope, like we did when we were practicing how to find the equation of a line, and use one of those 2 points to then write the equation in point slope, right? But realistically, I'm not going to make you find best fit lines by hand. It's good to understand that that's what a best fit line should look like. What we're going to do instead with this example is we're going to go ahead and talk about how to find one on your calculator. So on your calculator, a line of best fit is called a linear regression. So, best fit line on your calculator, right? The way we find a best fit line on our calculator is still using that stat button. Okay, so number one, we're going to press stat, but this time we're going to go over to calc. So, I'm going to go ahead and press stat again, but now you'll notice that next to stat, there's a thing that says calc, right? So I'm going to pick calc. Stat, calc, okay. When I get to calc, I'm then going to look for linear regression, which is 4. So 4 is lin reg. Sorry, I missed the I there. 4 is lin reg, okay. So I'm going to go down to linear regression, which says ax plus b. That's like mx plus b, right? It's like point slope. Okay, now, if your x is L1 and your y is L2, that's all you have to do is hit enter and it's going to give you that information. So if that's the case, you just hit enter and it's going to give you information. If not, after you hit lin reg and it's going to say ax plus b, you need to put in parentheses whatever your x list is, comma, whatever your y list is. And that's kind of frustrating and a bit tedious, okay? So if, for instance, you had that problem that we discussed where you used L3 and L4 because maybe you didn't have those in you didn't have L1 and L2 in your calculator, you'd have to type L3 and L4. Back after a brief interruption. So let's say that you don't have L1 and L2 in your calculator for whatever reason, you accidentally deleted them, so you've got lin reg, right? You would then have to type in, you'd pick L3 and L4, or whatever 2 lists you used, right? So whatever your X and Y lists were, right? So, for instance, I would put parentheses, right? And then I'd go to second 3, because that would be L3, comma, which is the key right above the 7, right? And then second 4, which would give me L4, right? Okay, so that's what I would do. But again, I'm not going to have to do that here because I used L1 and L2, which is why if you have the opportunity to use L1 and L2, you should, okay? So after I do this, either way, whether I use the standard L1 and L2 or I use something like L3, L4, right? I'm going to hit enter. So either way, right? Just like so I'm going to do this because I was in this situation where I didn't need L3 and L4, and I'm going to hit enter. And what's going to come up looks like this. Now, some of you might get something that doesn't have the R values there, and we'll talk about those R values in a sec. But what comes up is something that says y equals ax plus b, and then they tell you what a is, negative 7.854285714, great, and they tell you that b is a 185.8066667, great. So if you were writing this equation, you would write it as you'd probably use up to the thousands place in both of these cases. So you'd get y equals negative 7.854x plus 185.806 or 807, depending if you round or truncate for your b, right? And you can put that in your calculator. And that would be your line of best fit. Now, you'll notice that there's an r squared and an r. That r is what we discussed when we talked about correlation in the previous video, right? So in this situation, you can see that the r is a negative 0.800, right? What this tells me is this is a fairly strong negative correlation, right? It's strong because the number is close to a 1, much closer to 1 than it is to 0, and it's negative because the r is negative, right? And that r squared doesn't actually pertain to us right now, but you'll see it at some points in various stats classes. Now, if you didn't have, so if I were to write this line of best fit, I would probably write it as y equals negative 7.854x plus 185.806 or 807, depending on if you do what's called rounding, which would be a 7, or truncating, which just means cut the number off, and that would be a 6. So this would be my line of best fit, okay? Now, I could put that in my calculator, and I can show you that it would do a good job graphing. That would be my least squares line or line of best fit. And that's just fine. Now, a thing to notice about this is that if you didn't have those R values, you might want them. So I'm going to show you how to turn those R values on right now, okay? So let me erase all this stuff, and I'll show you how to turn those R values on. So in order to turn those R values on, okay, so what you're going to do, what we're looking for is a thing in our calculator that's called diagnostics on. So the easiest way to get to that is your calculator actually has a catalog, which is sort of like an index, right? So you're going to hit, so we want the catalog, so you're going to hit second, okay? You're going to hit second and the 0 button, which is going to give you catalog. Okay, so that's going to give you catalog. So hit second and then the 0 button and you'll see catalog. What you then want is you'll see in the top corner it's got that A symbol, that's because it's a letter. You then want to press the button that would give you D to jump to the D section of the index. So you want to press the X inverse button. The reason you want to do that is because you're already alpha locked, and that'll give you D. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to press that X inverse button and it'll jump to D. The reason you want to jump to D is it's going to take you a really long time to scroll the whole way down the catalog to get to diagnostics on. So then you're just going to scroll down. So you're going to scroll down until you get to diagnostics. I think it's probably diag on. Let's find out. Like Diagon Alley. Kidding. All right. So you're going to scroll down. Diagnostics on. Oh, it's the whole thing. So diagnostics on. Okay, so you can see there's diagnostics on and diagnostics off. So you're going to get that arrow next to diagnostics on. Okay, you're going to hit enter to select it. Okay, but then you actually haven't run the program. See how it says diagnostics on? Then you're going to hit enter again. So what this did was it selected what you want to run, and then you hit enter to run it. And when it's done, it's going to say the word done. So you hit enter, and it's going to say done. So now if you do that same step to get your line of best fit, you'll now have the R values. You'll have those diagnostics on. If you ever wanted to shut them off, it's exactly the same process, except instead of scrolling down to diagnostics on, you'd scroll down to diagnostics off, and it would be exactly the same thing. So that's kind of the gist. Cool. So we can walk through other examples of this if you want. We could definitely create some scatter plots on a calculator. But I think that basically the goal here is that when you work through your homework, you're going to want to be able to follow the steps of how to enter this in your calculator. Again, graphing a scatter plot by hand is not something I need you to be exceptional at. I just need you to be functional enough at it that you know, sort of hit the major points that are important, okay? And those were addressed at the beginning of the first video. So section 1.5 is a bunch of scales that you mostly will not need by hand.